Hi, everybody. So we're pressing on in our look at the biblical view of homosexuality, and of course, that's a pretty open title, I know, for people because one's biblical understanding of the issue differs from another. I know, but all I mean to say by that title is that we're going to be looking at the scriptures. Okay, there's so much discussion as to how people ought to think and feel about the issue overall. We always begin with the scriptural picture and then we work out how to live that scriptural picture in the real world around us. So we want to start there. That's what I mean by biblical. And we've looked thus far at the Genesis picture of things. So, at least as I was expressing it to you, Genesis 1, the passage about Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis, they tell us some things, but I don't know if there's anything definitive we could bring into the conversation to be persuasive. Only because people can, I think, poke some holes in some of the logic that's often presented about what the Bible teaches about homosexuality from those passages. It's just not real clear and maybe not that helpful. We did look last time at the passages in Leviticus, chapter 18, chapter 20, that seem to be, I think, more on point. Um, but the difficulty with that is that it's based in the Old Covenant, right? And we, as new covenant followers of Jesus, we don't abide by the fullness of the law of Moses. So some people might think that doesn't really hold much weight for us because, again, so many things in the Old Covenant were put to its proper ending in Christ when he fulfilled it that we can't really hold each other to those things. Um, I was trying to demonstrate just from looking at those texts that I think there's more to it than that. But I understand why some people would initially just dismiss it if it's in the Old Testament because we're not under the Old Testament anymore. I hope that I was able to show. I think there's more instruction for us there about the issue than may be obvious just in those two passages. So today we want to very humbly, very lovingly approach the question about what does our King say and what is his mind about this issue of homosexuality based on Jesus himself, what he taught and what he did. And I come to this one with some mixed feelings because both sides, and again, there might be more than two sides, there might be more nuance to it than that, but if I could just simplify, people who agree together that God is not in favor of homosexuality, as well as those who would say he accepts it and doesn't condemn it. I think both groups come to Jesus' teachings and they have to try to find if there's anything he himself has said to shed light on this issue. And I do know, as I was listening to and reading the voices of those who would promote embracing the homosexual experience within the churches um, as something that's acceptable to God, I should say, they would say that because Jesus was silent on the issue, then that means he didn't think it was that big a deal. And so why are we making it such a big deal? Like, not everyone who thinks that way would make that case, but I've heard and read that often enough that I think it's a common, what do you want to say, argument, or it's a common proposition that the modern day obsession with this issue doesn't match Jesus's mind and heart because he didn't bring it up specifically. And I have to admit that is true. Not necessarily where you take that line of thinking, but just the fact that Jesus did not bring this up specifically in his mortal days, in his mortal ministry to Israel. Um, and then there are those, of course, on the other side who would say there are things Jesus said that apply to homosexuality, what they would say is pretty clearly. So he did address it, just not in those terms. So what I want to try to do with you is just look through some of these texts, some of these ideas together of what Jesus taught, and just think through it as honestly as we can. Again, nobody comes completely objectively to, I don't think, any issue. But just try to put our own presuppositions on pause for a second and just look at Jesus's teaching, his life, his ministry, look at what others are saying and kind of weigh them and see where we land as individuals in our understanding of these things. So first of all, I want to address that question of what does it mean that Jesus never addressed the specific issue of homosexual. And again, I want to go where the Bible's gone so far, which is deal with behavior. Okay, we're not quite at the place of dealing with the issues of attraction, um, whether someone's born that way or chooses it. That needs to be talked through, but we're not quite there yet in the biblical view of it, because so far, in Leviticus, it's dealing with the action part of it. So that's where I want to hover for now. And Jesus never addresses specifically the homosexual act. Okay, whether it's good, bad, if he's indifferent to the whole question. So what does it mean then that he never did? Is it fair to say that if Jesus didn't bring it up specifically, he honestly didn't care? This is not an issue to him. Let's focus on things that are a bigger deal. Okay. I see a major problem with that logic right off the bat, which is I think we could find a lot of things Jesus never specifically talked about that we could confidently say he cares about. And so the logic doesn't hold there. I mean, you could pick some right now, some issues that are important. They're issues of how we deal with other people, how we deal with God's creation, how we deal with God, that Jesus didn't specifically deal with in his mortal ministry. And for us to draw that conclusion about all those other things and say, so Jesus doesn't care about it, it wouldn't hold water. And so then that raises the question, well, then why didn't Jesus, at least as we have the record of it, why didn't Jesus talk about all these really important things if they're so important? And I think it's not terribly difficult to see why. Because communication is largely based on audience, right? Based on the people you're talking to, what they're dealing with. And when Jesus came, remember, he didn't come as a teacher to all the nations, to everybody. He came as the teacher, the rabbi, to the Jews. And if you're wondering why I would say that, it's very specifically said by Jesus. He was sent in his mortal ministry. He was sent to the Jews, the lost sheep of Israel. A lot of his teaching was specifically towards or about the religious leaders, for instance, or it was to the people of Israel, poor, uneducated, sinful, righteous, the whole mix. But they were Israelites, right? And so you have to kind of understand Jesus' agenda in teaching wasn't to cover every topic that every human being will ever deal with. It was to deal with those people he was interfacing with directly to help them understand the kingdom of God, its power, its significance, why it's coming is such a big deal, what's available to everybody now who enters. He dealt with things, and if this was going to be hours long, we just dig into all of his teachings here. But I invite you, of course, you hopefully have your Bibles. You certainly have it available to you on the webs, the World Wide Web. So if you're watching me, you can get to the Bible, BibleGateway.com, Bible Hub, all these great things. You can look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Look at Jesus' teachings. And I think you'll find it interesting, the things he did talk about and the things he just never brought up. And you, if you're American, like I am, living in the modern age, you will find that you wish Jesus would have talked about way more things, specifically. And it doesn't mean he didn't care about any of them. It meant that it wouldn't have been relevant to the people he was talking to at the time. So this argument that Jesus' silence indicates indifference, it doesn't gel. It doesn't work. It doesn't mean it's wrong that he was indifferent. It just means that's not a good way to tell if he was indifferent about it. So for instance, the Jewish people, as we looked at last time, the Jewish people had a clear word from God about the sexuality that God accepted, sexual practice, and what he rejected, or what he found, again, the word that was used in that whole list, not just the one item, okay, the whole list of sexual practices God forbade, it was referred to as detestable or abomination, depending on your translation. But one reason I think Jesus didn't really go into specifics about different kinds of sexuality that he had a problem with, if he did, is because the law had already settled that. And he's talking to Jews who know the law. And so there's really no reason for him to rehash a lot of things for the Jews. What he came to do, and please, this is one of the most important things for us as disciples. What Jesus came to do, and you'll see this in Matthew 5 and 6 and 7 really clearly. He came to say, you have the law, the baseline. You know those things that are in the law. What I'm here to do is show you what you've missed in the law that maybe aren't obvious, that you need to know if you're going to live in the law the way God wants. And so he came to fulfill the law. That's how he put it. So just an example, you've heard it said, don't murder. That's the law. Awesome. You know that part, but I'm saying don't get angry. Let's go further. So that's why I think it's important that we don't buy something that just writes things off too quickly. Like the line, if Jesus didn't mention it, he didn't care about it. That's way too simplistic. It doesn't really get us anywhere in our conversation about this. And it's not honest. It really isn't. For instance, okay, can I give you a modern day example? How we treat creation matters to God. That is, I don't have any doubt about that. The scriptures are plain about that. In fact, just our created purpose as humans to care for the earth, to rule it, implying care for it, it says that. Now, did Jesus have any specific teachings about how to be environmentally savvy? Not really. The Sermon on the Mount doesn't have a section on how to be a great caretaker of planet Earth. That doesn't mean he doesn't care how we treat his Earth. You see what I'm saying? And there's so many other issues like that. I think that's all I need to say about that. So don't buy into a lot of these bumper sticker gotcha points that are made on either side. You gotta think through, is that really consistent? Because can that logic apply to other things besides homosexuality and still work? Now, there are some interesting things that, as I'm listening to the case being made scripturally from various people and various points of view about this, some interesting things were brought out of what Jesus actually did say, or people he did interact with, that I thought I would bring to you just for your consideration. Because the lack of Jesus's clear, specific teaching on this might make this a 2-minute video. It's like Jesus had nothing to say. But I think others have made good points about there might be implications about what Jesus said that apply. So I just wanted to walk through some of those with you. The word that Jesus would have used in the Greek language to speak of what we would have in our English translations as sexual morality, as the broad term, fornication, unchastity, things like that. That's a word in the Greek language, porneia. And that word is very general. It's a catch-all word. That's why sexual immorality is actually a pretty good phrase for this, because it's sexual in nature, yes. Thus, pornography comes from this word porneia. It's sexual in nature, yes, and it's the inappropriate kind of sexuality, but the problem is it doesn't really define anything for you. So it's like saying bad behavior. Okay, what's that? What's bad? What are you considering bad? So if you want to say bad sexual behavior is what this word encapsulates, then what does that include, right? So if Jesus uses this word porneia, or at least it's translated into Greek from what Jesus actually said, either way, it's a catch-all word. And so what some would say is that word includes homosexual behavior, just like it would include adultery and the other things listed in Leviticus 18 and 20. So the word porneia doesn't help us by itself, but with the context of the Jewish understanding of porneia, it does indeed include homosexual, specifically male with male. Remember, that's what the Leviticus passages talked about. It would include that just by virtue of them being under the law of Moses. And actually, that makes a lot of sense. I agree with that, insofar as Jesus is talking to people in a certain cultural background, a certain religious background, and the words he used would have been words that would have been understandable to the people he talked to. So if he says the word porneia, or the Aramaic equivalent probably, whatever baggage that word had for his audience, was the baggage, so to speak, he had in mind too, because he knew that's what they would be thinking, right? So if I say pull your leg, yeah, you pulling my leg, I should really only say that to people who know what that means when I say it. Because in other cultures, if I talk about pulling your leg, that's just bizarre. Why would you pull my leg, you weirdo? Right? So, in a certain culture, in a certain context, words mean certain things. And the same thing with porneia. In the Jewish understanding, it would have meant the forbidden sex acts of our law as Jewish people. Does that include male with male sexual activity? According to Leviticus, yes. And so I think as Jesus uses the word, and let me give you those passages. In Matthew 5:32, for instance, when he says that if a man divorces his wife for any other reason than porneia, sexual immorality, then he causes her to be an adulteress, and the man who marries her becomes an adulterer. Matthew 15:19, the things that come out of the heart are what make a man unclean, and he includes what comes out of a person, what comes out of a heart. He uses the word porneia, sexual immorality, along with things like theft, being a false witness, murdering, adultery. Again, this is not the pet sin here, okay? It's just one of the ways that mankind sins against God. He uses that word, and I think the Jews would have gotten him. They understood what he meant. This takes me back to, I think, what we talked about before in Acts 15, when the earliest Christians were trying to help their Gentile demographic, right? People that are not coming from the law of Moses, not coming from understanding how God taught his people in the Old Testament. They're just coming kind of fresh to this God of the Jews, the God of Jesus Messiah. They didn't have a lot of this background understanding of God's view. So do you remember in Acts 15, when the Jewish council that met, I shouldn't say, what am I saying? The Jerusalem council, that's what I meant to say. When the Jerusalem council met of the apostles and the elders of the church, and they told the Gentiles who were coming to follow Jesus, here's what you're needing to be careful about ethically, morally, as disciples of Jesus. Remember the four things. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Don't eat meat of strangled animals. Don't eat blood, and avoid sexual immorality or abstain from it. How are they going to know what they mean by sexual immorality? Again, look at the text, and James makes the point. They have been taught the law of Moses in the synagogues everywhere in the Roman Empire. If they don't know what we mean by sexual immorality, porneia, they can go find out at the synagogues what sexual immorality means to us, right? So that's how I'm seeing this. I do think Jesus addresses it in that broader term, and his audience probably would have included that in their understanding of what porneia meant. I will say this though, I think it's also fair to say in the first century in the Jewish culture where Jesus was in the homeland of the Jews, it's very doubtful that homosexuality would have been an issue that was very commonly dealt with. And I'm not going to even pretend to know if there were homosexuals practicing that behavior in that time and place. How would you even know, right? It's not like you put that in the newspaper or something to be found by archaeologists later. That's not my point. What I'm saying is, as a society, all the indications of what was passed down and written from that time period indicate that even if it was going on, it was not publicly, and it was not something that would have been common at all in terms of the eye of the society. Because as I said, the Jews had this already established understanding, this is not allowed by God. So this would have been something, if it was done in secret. It would have been something you didn't want publicly known or talked about. So that's one more reason why Jesus wouldn't really have a reason to talk about it very much. It wasn't something that, in fact, if I'll be honest here, and again, I'm not trying to score points for anything, I'm just trying to think logically through this. I would actually expect if Jesus did approve of this behavior, that would have been the reason to bring it up. So I think the argument that I mentioned earlier actually boomerangs on itself. The only reason I think Jesus would have had to bring up homosexuality specifically would be to change what they already understood. which was that God forbade it, at least male with male. The fact that Jesus didn't bring it up seems more likely to indicate he's okay with them having what they had already, what they had in Leviticus as God's standard. Real quick, and we're already 20 minutes in, good grief. Let me just mention these quickly. These other two issues that were brought up by others that I was reading, their writings on it. Jesus has this interaction in Matthew 8 with a centurion, and this is right after he gives the Sermon on the Mount, according to Matthew's telling. A centurion, a Roman, right, a Gentile who doesn't necessarily follow God's laws, he asked Jesus to heal his slave, an important slave, dear to him, as one translation would put it. And they point out that the word used here is slave boy. And culturally, they'd say, now, for a Roman, that probably indicates in that time, in that culture, it wasn't uncommon for an important, powerful, rich Roman man to have, sorry, explicit material coming, but to have a young boy or young slave, not only to serve him, but also to satisfy his sexual craving. Okay, and that's something that's going on in the world today, and we see it, and so that's been a part of the human story for a long time. Men in power taking younger boys and using them for that purpose, right? And what people have pointed out, well, Jesus healed this slave boy for the centurion, but didn't make a fuss about it. He didn't take that opportunity to tell the centurion, you need to stop doing this. This is immoral. This is wrong. So does that indicate Jesus was actually okay with it? All he wanted to know was that the centurion had faith. That's all that mattered. Again, I'm just trying to think about that honestly. Again, that doesn't really hold water for me, because that would imply that Jesus was okay with everything the centurion was doing in his life, since there's no record that he corrected him about anything. I don't know about that, right? Like, what do we know about the centurion? Almost nothing. We know that he really believes that Jesus can heal his slave, and that Jesus congratulated him for his intense faith, very great faith. That's all. So to suspect that because Jesus didn't call him out on anything in his personal moral behavior, everything he was doing was great morally, or Jesus was fine with it, I'm just like, that seems a bit of a stretch. I don't know. I want it to be consistent. So if we're going to bring it up about homosexuality, it should be true of everything. And that's true in everything we say, good or bad. It should match, right? So I just don't know that the story of the centurion is very helpful. I don't think it actually applies very well, because number one, we can't assume that that's what he was doing with this young slave boy. And number two, do you really think that Jesus would be okay with that? If that's the cultural scenario, is Jesus okay with that? Homosexual or not, is that okay? Slavery, first of all, that's a question. But slavery where you're forcing someone to satisfy your needs sexually because they're your slave, I don't know. It just doesn't add up to me. So that argument, or that proposition, I just can't go there. I'll let you decide yourself, but that particular one I don't think holds much water. So I don't think it helps us understand what Jesus would say about homosexuality, that little story there. Now the last one, and I'll stop here just for time's sake. In Matthew 19, 11 and 12, Jesus is dealing with the question of marriage, right? Marriage and divorce. And so he says something to his apostles after discussing marriage about eunuchs. And I want to bring this up, and I'll try to be brief about it, but I just want you to know this is on the radar within this discussion, what some are saying about it. So the disciples hear what Jesus says about not getting divorced, that you should honor God's vision of marriage from creation, and what God has joined together, let no one separate. So he says some pretty strong things about that. And he's saying that as a man who's not married, by the way, right? His disciples say to him, and this is in Matthew 19:10, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry. Like, that's their reaction. Jesus, if what you're saying is true, this is intense. Maybe it's better not to get married, if that's how bound together you're supposed to be. Now listen to Jesus' response in verses 11 and 12. Matthew 19, 11 and 12. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others and castrated. And there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of the heavens. The one who can accept this should accept this. In other words, Jesus seems to be indicate not everyone is going to get married or is meant to necessarily. So my words about marriage are for those who are going to get married. They need to know this because that's their life together. Now the focus here, in terms of this conversation about homosexuality, this topic has been brought up because it's suggested, or even flat out claimed, that when Jesus talks about eunuchs, he's talking about something in the ancient world which was understood to be, if you're naturally born a eunuch, that was understood, they would say, to be what we might call in the modern world effeminate or a homosexual man. Now, a eunuch was generally, if you were purposefully made into a eunuch, you were castrated. That's because you're working for somebody rich, like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. You were purposely castrated so that you wouldn't fool around with the ladies you're in charge of taking care of, okay? So either you're in charge of overseeing things for the queen or for a harem or whatever, but you're responsible for women, and the king doesn't want you messing with his women, so he castrates you, kind of making you a neutral issue sexually towards his women. And that's man-made eunuch, which means something was done to you. You weren't born that way. Something was done to you to make you that way. They would say, but if you're born a eunuch, as Jesus indicated, there are eunuchs who were born that way. And they would say that's the ancient lingo for being born with homosexual tendencies, or at least effeminate. And they will provide some documentation, and you can look this up, ancient view of eunuchs or something like that. Jewish and non-Jewish sources that seem to indicate they were aware of people who just had naturally less testosterone type things physically, even like how much hair you had and when you developed it, etc., the sound of your voice, mannerisms, things like that. And they would often be associated with attraction to men. And so anyways, they take what Jesus says here and they would say, see, Jesus acknowledges some people are born homosexual and he seems to be fine with that. Okay, you know what? Possibly. And Jesus is very smart, and no doubt he knew the cultural understanding of what it means to be born a eunuch. It doesn't seem likely that he's talking about people born without, testicles or something. That was rare enough. I don't think he'd bring that up. So we do have to figure out, what did Jesus mean by someone being born a eunuch? And so I'm pondering that. I'm thinking that through. And I think this is where we can start to talk about the difference between attraction to someone of your same gender versus acting sexually with them. Because if you will, again, think honestly and carefully with me now. Let's be consistent. When Jesus speaks of eunuchs, he is speaking of those born that way, made that way, or choosing to be that way for the kingdom. In his Jewish teaching to Jewish people, it seems very inconsistent to think what he's talking about is those who don't have sexual life with women because they're going to do it with men. That doesn't seem to be at all what Jesus is dealing with. So even if it's true that he's talking about men who aren't attracted to other men naturally, let's fill in that blank, which Jesus doesn't, but let's just fill in that blank and say, okay, maybe that means they are attracted to men instead. That actually doesn't address the question of what was Jesus's view of the act, the sexual act between a man and a man. Because that might indicate abstinence, chastity, not being sexual towards people generally, which would have been the Jewish expectation. So I'll round it out there. The teachings of Jesus may not be a clear slam dunk in any direction for our understanding, But we do need to be clear or careful with what we're hearing from others. When they throw some words of Jesus at you and say, see, here's what he thought, I'm cautioning you to be careful with that. There's more to it, maybe, than those gotcha proof texts from Jesus' teachings. Start from the Jewish law, because that's what his audience had in mind, right? That's what Jesus was coming to fulfill. If you start with the Jewish law that we looked at last time in Leviticus, and you think through what Jesus is trying to say and do for his Jewish people, that I think will help you understand what Jesus' words indicate about this, if anything. More than coming with a modern view and trying to shove it into what Jesus said and did. If he is silent, that probably indicates keep what you already have, my Jewish people, which is what we looked at last time in Leviticus. If he said something about it all and we had it on record, there might be more to say. But I'll leave it there. Keep looking at Jesus' words, not just about this issue, certainly. There's more in life to learn from Jesus than this. But try to take the whole thing as a whole rather than just picking out a few things here and there and drawing conclusions or letting others draw conclusions for you. It may not be consistent and may not take it all into account. All right, so that's our next look at it. Lots here to explore. We're going to be moving on next to indications in the words of Paul in his letters, and that's going to be some doozy stuff. We're going to get nice and deep there, and it might be a few either more shorter ones or a couple of longer ones to deal with those. But until next time, please comment, ask questions, challenge me on things. If you have links to resources that people can check out to have balance in our view, please post those as well. I would love for this to be a community conversation. And we look forward next time to seeing you, and we'll keep looking at the Word and trying to be humble and honest, trying to find the heartbeat of our Master about these and all things. Amen. God bless you. Bye-bye.